Chapter 3. It was the next day, and the Parker luck had struck again, hard. Peter had managed to get Dr. Stillwell on the phone, hoping for some insight or, at the very least, a lead on why Shellshock would want to steal his tech. But the conversation was nothing but bad news. "I've been racking my brain, Peter," Stillwell had said, frustration clear in his voice. "But the idea of combining my prototype with vibranium? It's absurd. Those two technologies weren't meant to work together. The backfeed alone would cause catastrophic instability." Peter winced. "Catastrophic like? Howty catastrophic? Like city block leveling catastrophic?" Stillwell replied grimly. "If someone's trying to merge these technologies, they're either a genius or a lunatic." "Probably both," Peter muttered, running a hand through his hair. The bad news didn't end there. Stillwell informed Peter that because his prototype had been stolen, the entire project had to be restarted from scratch. Worse, the funding they had relied on to expand their team, including hiring Peter, was now gone. "I'm sorry, Peter," Stillwell said. "I really wanted to bring you on board, but I'm afraid we're back to square one." Peter forced a polite smile through the phone, though it felt hollow. "No worries, Doc. Thanks for letting me know." Now, Peter found himself back to square one, too. No job, no solid leads, and no idea what Shellshock's endgame was. But there was a sliver of hope. During his scans of the turbines he'd retrieved from Shellshock's armor, he'd found a faint manufacturing signature. A little digging online had revealed it belonged to a company called Hayes Tech Innovations, a private firm specializing in cutting-edge energy solutions. Which is why Peter was now standing outside their glossy high-rise headquarters, staring up at the sleek, mirrored windows that reflected the mid-morning sun. "Well," Peter muttered to himself, adjusting his camera bag, "here goes nothing." He stepped through the front doors, trying to look as casual as possible. The lobby was pristine and futuristic, with polished floors and minimalist decor. A receptionist sat behind a sleek desk, typing away at a holographic keyboard. Peter approached her cautiously. "Hi," he said, offering his best disarming smile. "Peter Parker. I'm doing some freelance work for an Energy Expo article, and I wanted to see if I could talk to someone about Hayes Tech's innovations." The receptionist barely glanced at him. "Do you have an appointment?" Peter scratched the back of his neck. No, but..." "Then I'm afraid I can't help you," she said curtly, returning her attention to her keyboard. Peter sighed. Should have come as Spider-Man, he thought. Peter phased into the restroom briefly, only to make a sharp turn toward the elevators. With his camera bag slung over his shoulder, he pressed the call button and glanced over his shoulder. "Okay, Pete, play it cool," he thought, trying not to look suspicious. As the elevator doors opened, other passengers made a move to join him. Thinking fast, Peter raised his hands in mock protest. "Oh, no, trust me. You don't want to be in here with me. I had some really bad Chinese food for lunch. I'm, a bit gassy." One of the men, grimacing slightly, stepped back and gave Peter a polite nod. "I'll wait for the next one." Peter nodded solemnly. "Good call, buddy. Good call." As the door slid shut, Peter let out a sigh of relief. Alone at last, he glanced at the control panel and pressed the button for the top floor. "Evil CEOs always have the penthouse," he muttered to himself. As the elevator began its ascent, he tapped his foot along to the generic elevator music. Could really use some Star Wars theme music right about now. With a ding, the elevator doors slid open, revealing an enormous office. Peter stepped out cautiously, taking in the space. The room was tastefully decorated with modern art, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. A massive polished desk sat in the center of the room, flanked by bookshelves and sleek cabinets. "Doesn't look evil," Peter mused, scanning the room. No ominous lightning, no skulls, not even a creepy gargoyle statue. But that rug? Definitely evil. Nobody buys a rug that ugly unless they're hiding something. His eye zeroed in on a tray near the far wall. It was a refreshment station, complete with cookies, coffee, and a napkin dispenser. Peter's stomach grumbled slightly as he made his way over. A guy with cookies can't be that bad, he reasoned, picking up a napkin and grabbing a cookie from the tray. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took a bite of the cookie as he continued wandering the office. The moment the cookie touched his tongue, Peter grimaced and spat it out into the napkin. "Oh no, oh no, no, no," he muttered, reaching for his coffee and taking a large swig. His expression soured even more as he glanced at the offending pastry. "Oatmeal raisin? Of course it's oatmeal raisin. This guy's a monster." Peter crumpled the napkin, tossing it into the trash. "No such thing as a good oatmeal cookie," he muttered. "You take the oatmeal out, it's 10 times better, guaranteed. Anyone who likes oatmeal raisin is clearly hiding skeletons in their closet." Shaking his head at the crime against cookies, Peter refocused on the task at hand. He began searching the office, opening drawers and peeking inside cabinets, looking for anything, files, blueprints, or devices that might link Hayes' tech innovations to Shellshock. He rifled through some folders on the desk, but they were full of bland corporate reports. Nothing suspicious, at least on the surface. Moving to the bookshelves, he noticed a locked cabinet in the corner. "Aha," he whispered to himself. "Always something good behind a locked door." Peter crouched down and began working on the lock, his heart racing slightly as he listened for any footsteps outside the office. "Come on, Shellshock," he muttered under his breath. "Give me something to work with here." Peter paused, his fingers hovering over the lock as his attention shifted. Something on top of the cabinet had caught his eye. Lined up neatly were figurines of turtles, each one different in size and design, but all polished and meticulously placed. In the center of the collection was a framed photo of Mr. Hayes standing beside a young woman. Peter picked up the frame, examining it closely. "Does Mr. Hayes have a young wife?" Peter muttered to himself, tilting the picture to get a better look. Then he noticed the woman's eyes, sharp, intense, and unmistakably similar to Mr. Hayes. "No," Peter whispered, the realization dawning on him. "That's not his wife. That's got to be his daughter." He placed the photo back on the cabinet carefully. Peter froze as his spider sense tingled sharply. The faint ding of the elevator doors reached his ears, followed by the sound of footsteps, measured and purposeful. He turned his head slightly, careful not to move too much, and saw Mr. Hayes stepping into the room with long, deliberate strides. Behind him followed a stern-looking young man who seemed vaguely familiar. Peter squinted. "Wait a second, is that Calvin Drax?" The realization hit him like a bolt. He and Calvin had attended Professor Connor's class together in college. They weren't friends, not even close, but they had been academic rivals of sorts. Both had applied for the same prestigious internship at Smith Industries, though Calvin had ultimately been the one to land the spot. Peter hadn't thought much about him since then, which wasn't surprising. Calvin had always kept to himself, rarely engaging with classmates and staying firmly in his shell, as some of their peers had joked. All Peter really remembered was that Calvin was brilliant, no denying that. He'd had a sharp mind, especially when it came to engineering and theoretical mechanics. He was also from Hell's Kitchen and had only been able to attend college on a grant, which Calvin had worked tirelessly to keep. Now here he was, walking into Mr. Hayes' office, looking entirely at home. Peter caught snippets of their conversation as they entered, their focus completely on business matters. Increasing the energy output without destabilizing the core will require a full recalibration of the current specs, Calvin was saying. His tone was calm and professional, his sharp features barely betraying any emotion. "The prototypes are promising, but we'll need additional tests to ensure reliability." "You'll get what you need," Hayes replied firmly. "Just make sure the next demonstration doesn't fail. Investors don't care about setbacks. They care about results." Calvin nodded, his demeanor composed. "Understood. I'll handle it." Peter's eyes widened slightly as he pieced it together. Calvin was now the head of research and development for Hayes Tech. Well, that's one way to climb the ladder, Peter thought, his mind racing. The two men weren't paying any attention to their surroundings, too focused on their discussion. Peter seized the opportunity, quietly jumping onto a nearby pillar and positioning himself out of sight. Clinging to the smooth surface with practiced ease, he mumbled under his breath, "Hope they don't mind if I stick around." From his vantage point, Peter could see the desk, the turtles, and the photo again. Calvin and Hayes didn't seem to notice the photo or pay it any attention. Instead, they moved toward the desk, opening a drawer that Peter hadn't checked yet. Hayes pulled out a sleek tablet, handing it to Calvin, who began swiping through the files with a furrowed brow. Peter strained to hear more as Calvin spoke again. This data aligns with what we expected. Once we integrate the additional materials, the energy absorption should stabilize, but only if we maintain the integrity of the alloy. Alloy? Peter whispered to himself. His mind raced. Could they be talking about vibranium? He glanced at the turtles again, the pieces slowly falling into place. Shellshock's armor, the stolen vibranium spear, Stillwell's tech, it was all connected somehow. And Calvin Drax was right in the middle of it. Peter clung to the pillar, his muscles tense. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just business as usual at Hayes Tech. Something big was happening, and Calvin might be the key to unlocking the whole mystery. As Calvin and Mr. Hayes wrapped up their business talk, Hayes glanced toward the locked cabinet with a subtle nod. "Now, on to other things," he said, his voice calm but weighted. Calvin acknowledged the cue, walking over to the cabinet and punching in a series of keys. The lock clicked open, and he retrieved a thick file from inside. As he turned back toward Hayes, his gaze fell on the cabinet's top. His movement slowed as he noticed the picture frame lying face down and the turtle figurines slightly out of place. Peter, still clinging to the pillar, mentally smacked himself. "Oh crap. Stupid. How could I leave it like that?" Calvin frowned, carefully setting the picture frame upright and rearranging the turtles in their proper order. His brow furrowed as he lingered for a moment, then shook it off and carried the file back to Hayes. "Here's the file," Calvin said, placing it in front of Hayes. "Thank you, Calvin," Hayes replied, opening the file and scanning its contents. After a brief pause, he added, "That will be all." But Calvin didn't move. He stood rooted in place, his gaze lingering on Hayes. Hayes noticed and looked up, his expression sharpening. "Is there something else, Calvin?" he asked. Calvin hesitated, glancing back at the cabinet and its turtle figurines. "How are you doing, John?" he asked softly. Hayes's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" he asked. Calvin cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Her anniversary is coming up," he said solemnly. A shadow passed over Hayes's face. He leaned back in his chair, the file forgotten. "Please know that I'm here for you if you need anything," Calvin said, his voice steady but empathetic. "Your daughter, Lily, was truly special. Everyone who knew her misses her since she passed." Hayes's hand slammed down on the desk, the sound echoing through the office. Both Calvin and Peter flinched at the sudden outburst. Peter instinctively tightened his grip on the pillar, his spider sense prickling. "She didn't pass, Calvin," Hayes bellowed, his voice laced with raw anger. "She wasn't beyond her years, and it wasn't an act of God. She was taken from me." The room fell into a stunned silence. Even Peter, hidden above, felt a pang of shock at the intensity of Hayes's grief. Hayes's voice trembled with rage as he continued. "She was snuffed out by the same people she was trying to help. She dedicated her life to making that neighborhood better. And what did they do? They robbed her, gunned her down in cold blood, and not a single person lifted a finger to help." He jabbed a finger at the folder on his desk. "I'm going to make them all pay. Now that Wilson Fisk has been exposed and removed as the kingpin of crime, there's nothing standing between me and Hell's Kitchen. I'll burn that godforsaken neighborhood to the ground and send those roaches scurrying." The office fell silent again, heavy with tension. Calvin shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Peter, still hidden, processed the revelation. This guy's unhinged. But now it makes sense. Shellshock's tech, the vibranium spear, he's gearing up for something big, something destructive. The sharp ring of a phone shattered the silence, cutting through the weight of Hayes's fury. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to compose himself before picking up the receiver. "Yes?" he said curtly. It was his secretary informing him that his car had arrived. "Very well," Hayes replied, his voice once again calm and controlled. He stood, adjusting his suit as though nothing had happened. Calvin followed silently as Hayes walked to the elevator. The two men disappeared behind the sliding doors, leaving the office eerily quiet once more. Peter slowly exhaled, his mind racing. This is bigger than I thought. He's not just some vengeful CEO, he's planning to take out an entire neighborhood. Whatever Hayes was planning, it was clear that stopping him would mean stopping Shellshock too. Carefully, Peter climbed down from the pillar and moved to leave the office. He had to act fast. The clock was ticking and he was running out of time. Peter crept to Mr. Hayes's desk as soon as the elevator doors slid shut. He glanced down at the file Hayes had left open, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. Sure enough, it was packed with documents detailing Hayes's acquisition of key properties in Hell's Kitchen, an old automotive factory, a food processing plant, and several small businesses. Each location was marked on a map with bold red X's, and Peter couldn't shake the feeling that these purchases weren't just random investments. They were strategic. This guy's got something big planned, Peter muttered to himself as he pulled out his phone. He quickly snapped photos of the documents, making sure to capture every detail, from the addresses to the property deeds. As he flipped the last page, the faint ding of the elevator made his heart drop. The doors slid open, and Peter barely had time to duck down and retreat toward the window as Calvin Drax walked into the office. Calvin's sharp eyes immediately went to the desk. He frowned, noticing the files slightly out of place. His expression hardened as he looked around the room, his gaze sweeping every corner with suspicion. Peter held his breath, crouched low near the open window, praying Calvin wouldn't notice anything out of place. Calvin's eyes eventually landed on the window itself. His scowl deepened, and he walked over to it with slow, deliberate steps. He leaned out slightly, peering down at the city below and scanning the horizon for anything unusual. Peter clung to the underside of a nearby ledge just outside the window, hanging upside down and staying completely still. The cool breeze ruffled his hair as he silently cursed his luck. "Come on, Calvin, just go back inside." After a tense moment, Calvin seemed satisfied that no one was there. He pulled the window shut with a decisive motion and locked it before turning back to the desk. He carefully gathered the file, placed it back into the locked cabinet, and walked out of the office, his footsteps fading into the distance. Peter let out a long, silent exhale. That had been way too close. Once he was sure the coast was clear, Peter began to climb up the building, making his way to the roof where he could collect his thoughts. "Okay, Hayes is buying up Hell's Kitchen," he muttered to himself. "Factories, food plants, why? What's the connection?" His mind raced as he considered everything he'd learned so far. Hayes was clearly planning something massive, and whatever it wasn't just about revenge. It was about control. And now, thanks to the files, Peter had more pieces of the puzzle. The question was how they all fit together. Peter swung away into the night, determination burning in his chest. Whatever Hayes and Calvin were planning, he needed to stop it before it was too late.
Next time on Shellshocked. Next time on Shellshocked.
All right, that was chapter 3. I just want to say I'm actually having a lot of fun writing this series, and I want to say I appreciate everybody who is watching and who has liked and subscribed. I really appreciate it. I should have the next chapter up in a couple days, so watch out for that. And if you guys like what I'm doing here, check out some of my other videos. I would really appreciate it. All right, catch you guys on the next one.